All right, thank you for your patience. My name is Laura, and I'll be doing the third Flipgrid. All right, so far we've learned about the theory and practice of assessment for ESL through Gottlieb, and we've also talked about different types of assessment, such as the alternative assessment and the traditional assessment, and we've also learned about the 5 principles of language assessment: practicality, reliability, validity, authenticity, and washback. So now we're gonna do it like Dora does. I'm gonna pause the video and give you guys some time to do this little matching activity. So I have a few questions that one would ask to analyze a language assessment, and I want you to match them to the principle that they apply to. So you can go ahead and pause your video. All right, and there are the answers. I'm sure you guys all aced it. So in this lecture, we're going to cover language test design, including the purpose, how to write objectives, what specifications you should have, item design specifically for multiple choice questions, and then how to administer the test and score it. And that is based off of the Brown and Abeywickrama chapter 3. And then we'll move into chapter 2 of Law and Eckes, which is testing and alternative forms of assessment. And we'll talk about the consequences of high stakes testing and balanced assessments. All right, so let's get straight into it. Here I have some critical questions which they included, which you can pause and read if you want to, but we're just going to go through them. All right, so what's the purpose? What is this test being used for? That's one of the questions you should ask yourself. Is it being used to place a student? Is it being used to see what they've learned? And then you should also ask yourself, do I need to administer this test at this point in time? Are you just feeling like you should because it's the end of a unit, or do you actually need to know what your students have learned? And then also, how important is this test compared to other measures of student performance, like their participation in class or their tasks, or their performance-based task performance? And then what will you use the results for? And what washback will the test have? Will you be able to provide beneficial feedback to your students? All right, so for objectives, when we write them, we should write them asking ourselves, what should the students know, or what should they be able to do after the end of a unit or lesson? And they should be specific. You should include the context and whether they will be doing comprehension or production. So will they be listening or reading, or speaking or writing? And those also include the categories of whether it would be oral or written. And an example that I modified from the textbook is students will correctly produce written forms of the simple present tense and personal narratives. So it mentions that it's a written form and it's production, and it's very specific because I'm talking about simple present tense. And then I talk about the context, which is a personal narrative. All right, so for our test specifications, the book mentions it's like a blueprint. So you should describe the content of the exam, which should match your objectives, and you should outline the test organization and decide what item types you'll use. Will you use multiple choice, true, false? What tasks will you use? Like, will you use a written essay or a passage? What skills will be included, and then how the test will be scored. So you need to have an idea of your scoring criteria, and then how you'll report the score to the students. It is important to note that for standardized tests, the specs are more formal and detailed, and they are also kept confidential to ensure validity, because you don't want people knowing what's going to be on the ACT before they take it. But for classroom tests, we don't want to keep it confidential. We want to give our students a heads up, so they should know what types of items will be on the test, which, relating back to the previous chapters, it should be tasks that they have seen before. And they should know what the content is, and it should match up with your objectives. All right, so when you devise test items, you should consider the elicitation and response formats for the items. And I'll talk about these on the next slide. And then you should also consider the objectives you will cover. And again, you need to let your students know these objectives and the topics and the grammatical and phonological forms that they will be required to know. And they should also know, or you need to consider the number of items in each section and the time allocated for each section, and also the scoring criteria, which should be simple and straightforward. The book mentions grading a conversation, and each little interaction was graded either 2, 1, or 0, with a 2 being near perfect grammar and pronunciation. And then a 1 is they made a few errors, and then a 0 is it was basically like they hadn't responded at all, or it's just really hard to understand. All right, so for the elicitation mode, it can be either oral, where the student listens, or written, where the student reads. And you can have pre-recorded conversations, or they can read an excerpt from a story. And then these can have either a oral or a written response. And it's important to note that if the elicitation mode is oral, it doesn't have to be an oral response mode. It can be either oral or written, and the same thing for a written elicitation mode. But you do need to pay attention and use your intuition to match the elicitation mode with a proper response mode. The book mentions an example where you're doing a minimal pair. So if you say a word out loud orally, the response probably shouldn't be a yes or a no oral response, because that doesn't make sense. So it might make more sense to have them write what they hear. So that's just an example. All right, so multiple choice items, one of their benefits is that they are practical because they are quick to grade. However, as the book mentions, they take longer to write because you have to be very careful with them. So you might not be saving time in the long run. Also, they are reliable because there's not really room for intra-rater bias, I guess, because all you're doing is seeing what letter the students have written. Some drawbacks, however, are that they are difficult to design correctly, and you do have to put a lot of thought into them. And they only test recognition. They do not test recall or production. And guessing can affect the scores. So if you want to know what your students have learned, you might think they learned something, but really they're just a good guesser. They also restrict what can be tested, and it's hard to provide beneficial washback because I've never seen a teacher really give feedback on a multiple choice question. And they can make cheating easier because just with a glance, someone can cheat. So I got this graphic from coursearc.com, and the first part of multiple choice question is the stem, and then you usually have about 4 or 5 options or alternatives, and these include 3 distractors. So they're things that are potentially alluring, like they could, they could kind of be appealing, but they're definitely not correct. So you need to have one answer that is the correct answer, and the book also calls that the key. All right, so some guidelines for designing multiple choice items. You should make sure to design each item to measure a single objective, and this was something that Dr. Maglio really emphasized in measurement and evaluation Ed 601. So you'll notice here, the students are being asked to fill in the blank. However, options B and C, well, I guess option C, where post office is, that is incorrect because there is not an article. And so option B is correct because it uses an article and it has the correct order, word order for an indirect question. So here you're testing 2 different things. You're testing whether they know to use an article in front of post office and whether they know the word order of indirect question. So this is not a valid question since it falls under 2 objectives. All right, so the stem of the question and the options need to be stated simply and directly. The book mentions this first one. It could simply just say, I think I'd better go to the blank to have my eyes checked, because in the stem, have my eyes checked, that's just enough context to let you know it's the optometrist. And all this other stuff can just be confusing to the students and trip them up and increase their anxiety. So keep it simple. Also, we need to not make the question or the answers, the alternatives, redundant. So in this case, they all say which were, so you can just go ahead and put that in the stem and then leave the blank for, in this case, especially. All right, so we should make sure that the intended answer is clearly the only correct one. The stem of this question says, where did George go after the party last night? And then to Elaine's place, and he went home. Those could both possibly be the correct answer. So that's not a very good multiple choice question. All right, and something that's optional is you can use item indices to accept, discard, or revise items. However, this is a time-consuming process, so it's mostly done for standardized tests. But I do want to mention one, which is item facility. So you take the number of students that answered the item correctly and divide it by the total number of students that responded to the item. So if 13 students out of 20 responded correctly, you would divide 13 by 20 and get 0.65. And you want to keep it between 0.15 and 0.85. And obviously, the lower it is, that means fewer students are getting it right. And the higher it is, more students are getting it right. So this is kind of a sweet spot so that it's challenging enough for the students that are excelling. And then it's also easy enough that the students are struggling can still get some right and have a boost of confidence. All right, so when you revise a test, you should ask yourself, are the directions clear? And you can always have someone else look at it and read it to make sure they are. And then you should probably have example items in each section, but if the tasks are familiar, if they already know how to do multiple choice questions, you don't really have to have an example. You need to make sure each item only measures one objective, and each question should only have one correct answer. The items should be written in clear, simple language. And it shouldn't be redundant or have just excessive context that's unnecessary. And then the distractors should be clearly wrong, but also sufficiently alluring. And the difficulty level should be appropriate, which you can do the item facility to measure that. Well, after the test is taken. The language should be authentic. And like we've read earlier, it's really great whenever you can have some sort of thematic organization. Like if you have several multiple choice questions, if you can make it like a dialogue instead of having them decontextualized, because that's inauthentic. Yeah, there should be a balance between easy and hard items. The hard items can be challenging for the students that are excelling. The easy ones can help those that are struggling. And then the test as a whole should reflect the learning objectives. Some additional considerations. Before you give the test, you should go through the test slowly and methodically and time yourself to make sure you give the students enough time for it. The pages should be clear and uncluttered. And if you're printing out images, make sure they come out clear. And then the audio or video, if you have it, you should practice it beforehand and make sure it's clear and can be heard throughout the room. So when you administer the test, you should tell the students the conditions. So like how long is the test and what type of items are on it. You can also tell them whether they need to bring a dictionary or scratch paper and give them some suggestions. And if it's something like an essay, you should give them the evaluation criteria like a rubric beforehand. You can also offer a review session and then answer any of the questions that the students bring up. And then on test day, you should arrive early and make sure the classroom conditions are beneficial for test taking. And then you should make sure your video and audio work, have extra paper, start on time, distribute the test, and then still be available for student questions without being distracting to them. And then also warn the students when their time is about to run out. All right, so the score should reflect the relative weight of each item or section. So if you're having the students do a paragraph or something, that should probably be weighted more than a multiple choice question. Also, it's important to note that grading is not as simple as it seems because there are a lot of expectations that affect it, like the individual expectations of the teacher or the student, cultural expectations, institutional expectations, for example. And you should also give feedback by indicating the correct and incorrect responses. And if you have a rubric, you should score each element of it individually. And you can also provide oral feedback after a performance, or if you have time, you can have post-test conferences with each individual student. You can write suggestions in the margins on an essay. If everyone struggled with a question, you should probably have a whole class discussion and then reteach it if they were struggling. And then you can also encourage the students to do self-assessment. So here is a flowchart that kind of sums it up. So you should determine the purpose of the exam, state the objectives, then draft the specifications, and then select the items, administer the tests in a way that they can all have a peak performance, and then you should grade it and provide feedback. All right, so now we'll talk about testing versus alternative forms of assessment, which is from Law and Eckes, Chapter 2. All right, so they mentioned that data is used to make instructional and policy decisions, and good data is necessary to make sound decisions. It's kind of like a building. You need a solid foundation and you need solid ground below a building so that it can be sound. Nowadays, the stakes for standardized tests, they have gotten higher because there's a lot of money tied to it, both for scholarships and then also funding for institutions, and people, you know, whether they pass a class or whether they graduate or whether they get into college, all of this is riding on a lot of high stakes tests. So Stiggins gives 4 principles of good data. He says that they should have a clear target, an appropriate sample should be obtained, there should be no interference or bias, and the results should be usable. So keeping the high stakes standardized tests in mind, I want you to think whether these they like exist. It does have a clear target or it doesn't. So you can think through for each of these points. Go ahead and pause the video and then we'll discuss the answers. All right. So high stake tests, they do have a clear target, or standardized tests, I should say, because they know what they're assessing. They're assessing, like when I took the MAP test for math, it was 5th grade math or whatever. And they also have, or sorry, they do not have an appropriate sample that is obtained because someone has to fail. Someone has to be in the basic category. And it's only a one-shot deal, which coming from a biology background, you know, we like to do several trials. We like to watch things over time. And so this is just one little snapshot and it doesn't really reflect the student or the progress that they're making. And it also doesn't tell us what they know. If we just get a percent or their cut score, we're not going to know like what things they actually are struggling with and what we need to reteach. So it's not very beneficial to instruction. Also, the idea that that good data does not have interference, well, this fails it because it does have interference. A lot of these standardized tests are culturally and linguistically biased. A lot of them are made for white middle-class people from the East Coast. I've heard examples about math questions talking about city blocks. Well, if you're from rural Missouri, you might not know what a block is, and so that doesn't really make sense to you. Also, the questions do not have context and they can be misread and poorly written. So students might not be showing what they know just because they misread it. Also, testing companies and test readers make mistakes. Sometimes test readers, you know, they get fatigued and then they make mistakes. And I've heard of testing companies saying that people flunked a test and then they weren't able to graduate high school. And then they came back and said, oh, actually, we made a mistake and you did graduate, but it kind of had negative effects on those people. Also, they lack predictive value because the real world is not a multiple choice exam. We get to use creativity and all these other types of intelligences. So just because someone does poorly on a multiple choice exam doesn't mean they're not going to succeed in the real world. Also, these standardized tests do not have usable results because they don't have teachable moments. The students don't get the test back and they can't see the feedback, so they're not going to learn from their mistakes. Also, the data takes months often to get back to the teachers, so it's not really useful to them. And like I mentioned, it doesn't measure the other intelligences and it diverts resources away from learning as it takes time away. We used to spend like a whole week doing testing and that takes time away from learning. And also it takes money away from buying books or laptops or other resources that can be used for learning. All right, so now I have a video and this is from a documentary called Love Them First. And it's about an elementary school up in Minneapolis. And this elementary school had really poor scores on the standardized test. So they were labeled as like a failing school, and they had to send letters home to the parents saying, I'm sorry, your child goes to a failing school. But then they worked really hard, and the teachers and the principal, they clearly, like from watching this documentary, they really care about the students, and they work so hard. Not only did they work on education stuff, they worked on having a boxing program so students could get out their aggression or whatever. So yeah, this is after the principal, she got word that they had succeeded on the standardized test and they were no longer a failing school. And then the superintendent came back and said, we made a clerical error, you actually still are a failing school. And this is after she had told everybody, the teachers and the students, that. So they had gotten their hopes up and then had them crash. So yeah, let's watch it.
I wish I wouldn't have got so excited.
This is the principal.
I wish I would have just been like, great. Because then to find out that it was a mistake. The superintendent came and he said he needed to talk with me about our designation. He said that there had been a clerical error.
I take responsibility as superintendent for this error, and I want to apologize to the staff, students, the community that we weren't able to provide the necessary information the state needed to do the calculation. These designations, whether we want to agree with them or not, they have an impact on schools.
What do we do? What do we do now? The staff cannot, these teachers cannot hear this.
Building the light up, like you're making a difference, and then to take it away.
After we told the children.
After the kids, now you have to tell the babies, like, oh, just kidding. We didn't make all of that growth. It breaks my heart. And it's not our fault. We've done nothing wrong at all.
Yeah, so obviously, scoring mistakes on these standardized tests, they can have serious effects and cause a lot of pain. That was unnecessary. And some other consequences of these high stakes testing assessments is it often causes teachers to teach the test, which replaces the creative curriculum. And because of them doing more drilling, there's less high level thinking and less use of these other types of intelligences. And there's also some manipulation, such as putting English language learners into special education. That way they won't be counted towards the school's performance on the standardized tests. In some schools even suspend the quote unquote dumb students during testing, or they encourage them to drop out just so they won't have their scores affected. And sometimes there's cheating, and you might think that it's the students doing the cheating, but it's oftentimes the teachers and the administrators. And in 2011, there was a case in Atlanta where 178 teachers and administrators admitted to changing the answers to increase test scores. And they found out because there was a ton of eraser marks on all the scantrons, and the test scores had improved by like 45% in 1 year. And a lot of the teachers said that they had been forced to change the answers. They had been threatened with losing their job. But it's really sad to see. All right, so now we'll talk about standardized proficiency tests, which are used for English language learners. And again, you can pause the video and think, do these have a clear target, yes or no, and so forth with these questions. All right, so these tests do have a clear target. They have the goal of analyzing the level of English language proficiency. However, they again are not obtaining an appropriate sample because it only measures a single occasion and the skills are fragmented. The book gives an example where there's a blank and they just fill it in with the right article, which I've taken some like placement tests for Spanish, and sometimes you don't know what the sentence is saying, but you know what the article should be because I guess, you know, it agrees in the gender and number with the noun. So like it makes you look like you know more than you do, but you don't. And also there's no meaningful context. We've read this before with the traditional assessments, how they're very decontextualized compared to alternative assessments, and they're very inauthentic. Also, this does have bias, so it fails the idea that there should be no bias. And they are very culturally and linguistically biased. The book mentions students, you know, reading about building a snowman, but if they are from a tropical country, they might not have a word for snow. So who can blame them? Also, the results, they're like somewhat usable. They get you in the ballpark, but the book mentions giving a nationwide sample to, or to primary, they gave the proficiency test to primary English speakers in a nationwide sample, and 42% were classified as limited English proficient. So it's not super usable. All right, but the book says testing is here to stay because we have confidence in tests, even though they don't really deserve it. We're reluctant to change. These tests are cost effective, and they provide hard data, which people like. So yeah, they're providing the information that the stakeholders want. So here I have a Venn diagram comparing and contrasting assessments versus testing. So these tests are formal and standardized, and they occur on a single occasion, which we know is not a very good thing. They are timed, and the procedures are applied consistently, which some would think makes it more reliable. Versus assessments collect information about what students can do, and they gather information in various ways, and they occur at different times in different contexts. So they can show progress over time, which is better than just having a single snapshot. But the goal of both of these is to collect information to make decisions, and they do just get samples of student knowledge, skills, and abilities, although assessments probably get more because you do it more often. But then we use these samples to make inferences. All right, so again, we'll do this activity for alternative assessments. Do you think they have a clear target? Yes or no? Do they have appropriate, or do they obtain appropriate samples? Do they not have bias? And do they have usable results? So you can pause the video and think about it. All right, so these alternative assessments, they do have a clear target, and they do look at performance across time. So they are dynamic, which is good. And that also ties into having an appropriate sample, and they use different methods as well. They're kind of iffy on not having bias because it's difficult to manage, and they are more subjective, which makes it less reliable. So there could be the potential for bias. And again, even though we might make them for English language learners, they still can be linguistically biased and culturally biased, like we saw before. And they are valid if you're assuming that the individual teacher's inferences are true, but they're hard to standardize because teachers are unique individuals. However, the results are very usable, and they can help us make decisions about what we're going to teach, and they can also verify that learning happened. Right, so the book mentions balance assessments, or it says counterbalance assessments, and these assessments mix standardized tests with day-to-day classroom assessments. So you're using both to make judgments about what students have learned. And they cover a wide range of student abilities, as we've seen with the alternative assessments, and they recognize that achievement can be measured with unconventional methods. All right, so now we'll go into my critical commentary, which one of my questions is, are standardized tests really that objective? All right, so many claim that standardized tests are objective, and that's why we like them so much, because the traditional assessments, they just really value objectivity, and people think that alternative assessments are subjective. But personally, I think although standardized tests are more reliable because they can give the same test to the same student on different occasions and get the same score, although they're reliable, they are still subjective because the cut scores are subjective. So where they draw the line between basic, proficient, and advanced, I think those lines are very subjective. And I personally believe alternative assessments are better because they're dynamic, so they can show growth over time. And we do them on more than one occasion. All right, so this video will explain a little bit about performance level descriptors and cut scores.
Classifications, performance level descriptors, and cut scores. Classifying students into performance levels begins with writing performance level descriptors, or PLDs. PLDs, sometimes called achievement level descriptors, describe what students in a particular performance level are expected to know and be able to do, and are often phrased in relation to grade level standards. For example, a PLD for the basic performance level might say that a student has not met grade level standards, whereas a PLD for advanced might say that a student has exceeded grade level standards. Sometimes, the PLDs provide details about the skills within standards that students should know. Once performance level descriptors are defined, testing programs specify the location on the test scale that differentiates one performance level from the next. These are called cut scores. You can think of that term as cutting the scale into different performance levels. Cut scores might use the scale score metric, or the raw score metric, that is, the number of questions answered correctly, depending on how the test is scored. The concept of cut scores is used in many different fields, even if it's not called a cut score. For example, loan companies set credit score ranges for which credit scores are considered poor, fair, good, or excellent credit. So, how are cut scores set? There are a number of different ways of deciding what exact number is the location on the scale that differentiates performance levels. Sometimes a panel of experts, such as teachers and content specialists, are convened to collaboratively make judgments about where cut scores should be placed based on considering the expectations specified in the performance level descriptors and closely reviewing the items on the test. In other cases, real student data may drive cut score placement by seeing which percentage of students would fall into each performance level for certain cut scores. Often, cut scores are set with both data and expert judgments. Cut scores can tell you just how far away a student is from a higher or lower performance level. For example, if a student is classified as proficient on a mid-year benchmark test, but scores very close to the cut score distinguishing between proficient and advanced, that student may hit the advanced category with just a little bit of growth by the end of the year. Cut scores can also be used to set goals with students because you can see just how much a student must improve by to make it to the next performance level. Keep in mind that there is always some variability around a score. The variability is referred to as the standard error of measurement and helps provide a level of confidence around a score. Regardless, it is typical for students to be classified into performance levels based on their single score. Study Island state-specific benchmark assessments are built from the state assessment.
Right. So that video says that the student score tells us how much students need to improve by to make the next cut score. But I would argue that these cut scores are very arbitrary and subjective, and who cares about how much they need to improve to make the next cut score? Like, what we should be caring about is that they're just continuously improving. And also, I'll mention this later, but the State Board of Education, they get to decide, along with a panel, they decide where the cut scores are. So they could just lower the cut score and then the student could be in the advanced category or the proficient category. But that doesn't really show that the student is improving. And also, if they're dividing it up by X percent of students should be in the advanced, such and such percent in proficient, and such percent in the basic category, those percentages are just arbitrary. The video mentioned that the basic level is meaning that you have not met the grade level standards, but aren't these standards also arbitrary? There is no absolute truth that a fifth grader should know this much math or be able to understand such and such passage. To me, that's very arbitrary. I guess I should talk about these graphics down here. To me, if the policymakers move the cut score, it's just like someone moving the finish line. So it really doesn't make you improve your mile time or whatever. It just is a moving of the finish line. So how good is good enough? I read an article by Rotherham, and he said that cutting or setting cut scores is an inescapably subjective process, which I agree with. And he says that cut scores are the result of professional judgment rather than absolute truth. And this professional judgment is made by a score setting panel that includes teachers and curriculum specialists. Which I would argue if teachers can be on these panels and set the cut scores for determining what is proficient, then why can't teachers just determine what is proficient in their own classrooms with alternative assessments? So after the score setting panel has set these cut scores, it gets ratified by the State Board of Education. And as I mentioned earlier, state policymakers, they want to have more passing scores, so they oftentimes apply pressure to lower the cut scores so more students are falling into the advanced and proficient categories. And Rotherham mentions that it's meaningless to compare cut scores between states. So that just shows how arbitrary these categories are and how subjective they are. All right, so let's reflect. What is the purpose of assessing the students? It's to see what they've learned, and it's also to guide future instruction. And the more specific the information, the better. I guess from my own experience, I've taken several standardized tests, as you all have, and we would get our little score report card, and it would say you were either advanced, proficient, or basic, and it would have maybe a raw score too. And it might break it down into reading and math, but that was about it. So it wasn't specific information about what part of math I was struggling with. It wasn't specific information about what grammatical structures I struggled with. So then it was completely useless to my teacher to decide how to continue with instruction, and she didn't know what to reteach or work with me on more intensely. So yeah, I would just have you guys ask yourselves, like, do standardized tests achieve the purpose of seeing what students have learned and guiding future instruction? Okay, and lastly, I have some true questions. So if teachers are included on the panels that determine what cut score on a standardized test is proficient, should teachers be allowed to determine whether classroom performance, for example, on an alternative assessment, is proficient without using standardized tests? Yeah, I kind of mentioned this before. Teachers are included on these panels determining the cut score for, okay, higher than this is proficient. So why can't they do that in their own classroom with alternative assessments determining, this is the level I expect and higher than this is proficient? And then my second question is, should the resources, the millions of dollars and the time used for standardized testing, oh, sorry, I do have a typo. Let's see, one moment, please. Okay. Should the resources, the money and time used for standardized testing go directly to the students instead of to standardized testing? Although this will probably make the testing companies very disappointed. And then how else can we hold students accountable? Can we do this by testing at the classroom level? And that is it. So yeah, I look forward to hearing your all's responses on Flipgrid. Thanks for watching.